Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on the 6 horsepower twin cylinder Mercury engine. This particular model I believe was made in the mid to late 1960s and definitely shows its age. Unfortunately, I don't know a whole lot about it. This motor was pulled out of the trash by my friend Jason, but from looking at it externally, I can tell that this one is definitely going to be a challenge. The throttle is frozen. We have a hinge right here that is also frozen. And whether the engine is frozen or not, I'm not sure. The recoil does move and returns slowly, but I don't think it's actually engaging the engine. Or if it is, then we have absolutely no compression. So yeah, is this gonna run again? I am not sure, but that is what we're gonna find out today. So let me set up a little bit better and get going on this. Well, surprisingly, it looks pretty clean in here. The spark plugs look like new. So chances are someone was chasing an issue on this before they gave up on it. The flywheel also looks to be in great shape. Engine's not locked up. And there's definitely a bit of compression. So yeah, that gives us hope. Let's try the recoil. And yeah, it's not engaging the flywheel at all. So that is definitely an issue. Looks like we can get the recoil off. There's just a couple screws going around, and we can get a better look at what's going on. Looks like we also have maybe a seal that the glue deteriorated on. So that is something we need to look at. And the throttle, it's hard to tell where it's seized, but given that, we're actually greased up pretty well in here, I'm thinking that it is seized somewhere in here. So I'm going to get a little bit of penetrating oil on here. And while we let that soak, we'll get the recoil off and see if we can't get this to rotate the engine. All right, it's moving, and it's actually moving the linkage up the carburetor. So I wouldn't say it moves well, but we should be able to free that up. So we'll just give that a bit of time to work its magic. Let's turn our attention to the recoil. So it looks like there are 3 dogs right here that are supposed to pop out when you pull the starter recoil, and that engages the flywheel. So that, for whatever reason, is not happening. So let's get this over to the bench, take a closer look, and see if we can't free up that mechanism. Yeah, so these are not moving at all. And it does not look like there's any way to take this apart, at least on this side. But there is a nut. We've got some, looks like a washer that's folded over to hold this in place. So, we could take that off. Of course, if we do that, likely the spring is going to come flying out. So let's just try to move these maybe first with a screwdriver, see if we can't free them up. No, those are pretty locked in there. So I think we need to take it apart. So there's a washer on this side, which has some tabs you can bend over to hold the nut in place. So let's straighten those out. Get the nut off. And take the recoil apart. Let's reverse thread. And we just lost the spring tension, so it looks like we need to use that slot to put that spring tension back when we reassemble this. And we're going to have to remove the rope. Interesting. Doesn't seem to be locked up. Or actually, I take that back. That one is. And that one was. Okay. So it might have been as simple as taking it apart, because now everything moves. But regardless, I'm going to clean these up, maybe put some fresh grease on here before putting it all back together. Let me get the cover back on. Like that. Okay, I'm going to take that for the win. Still not perfect, but it's a lot better than what it was. So I'm going to bend the tab over, we'll get this reinstalled, and then we'll check the engine for compression. And in retrospect, probably would have been better to do the spring tension after tying the handle back on. Okay, wouldn't say it works great, but at least it works. So let's get the plugs out. I want to get a little bit of oil in the cylinders, then we'll check the compression. So the plugs that came out don't look quite as new as I thought they were, but at least there is no rust. And I would say the engine may have been running a little bit rich. Anyway, I just turned the engine over a few times. It felt pretty good. So let's get the compression tester in the bottom cylinder, see where it's at. So I realize the fact that we put oil in there, it's going to skew the reading a bit. It's going to make it potentially higher than it really is, which is fine. You know, at this point, I'm just looking to see that we have anything for compression. So we want it to be ideally 100 or more. And the throttle, not sure if it's open or not, but let's give it a few pulls. Okay, good. We're at about 110 PSI. So the bottom cylinder should have enough to fire. Let's see where the top's at. All right, one pull, we're at 50. All right, we're up to 70. Okay, 4 pulls like the other cylinder, and this one's a little bit lower, but it's at 100. And that should run. And I'm hoping, once it does run, potentially those numbers could come up. So let's check for spark. So we'll start with the top one. Just going to put the plug in loosely. And we'll put the spark checker on. And what we want to see is that light turn green. So let me move you a bit better so you can see that. Okay, and no spark. Let's check the other. Okay, and we don't have spark, so I'm hoping this has points. And if it does, it's likely under that flywheel. Yeah, those points, they are pretty corroded. It's like that on both sets of points. So let's clean those up and hopefully we'll get spark back. So I'm going to check the points gap. Not sure what it should be on this engine, but usually most would be around 18 to maybe 20 thousandths of an inch. So let's start with an 18 feeler gauge. And it fits, but it's actually opening the point. So let's try a 15. Yeah, it's a loose 15, so it's probably a 16, which actually isn't too bad. Let's check the other side. All right, the other side, the points are open. And that was actually tight. That's a 16. So let's go down a little bit. Let's try a 14. It's pretty tight, 14. So maybe it's actually closer to a 12, which is too tight. So I'm going to look up the specs. Yeah, and a 12 fits in there. So it's actually tight, probably on both sides. We're at 16 and probably a 12, maybe a 13 on that side. So I've been looking, trying to find specs for this engine, and there's a lot of conflicting information out there as far as the points gap goes. So I've seen anywhere between 18 thousandths and 30. And given that we're pretty tight right now at 16 and I think about 12, I'm going to open these both up to 18. We can always adjust this later if we find out it's wrong. The other thing I'm noticing too is that, most points systems have a cover. This one doesn't, but you can see where the screw holes are to hold that missing cover down. So without that, it's going to get a little bit dirty and contaminated, and the points are just going to need to be cleaned more often. But, this engine probably isn't going to be used a whole lot. Anyway, let's adjust the gap, and then we'll test for spark. That feels pretty good right there. If anything, it might be closer to 20, which is fine. Let's just double check that. And actually 20 doesn't fit, so I think that gap is likely a 19. So close enough. I'm going to rotate the engine until these points open up. And we'll do the same over here. That feels pretty good right there. Yeah, they may have loosened up a little bit when snugging those down. The gap looks pretty big. So an 18 has no drag. Let's check a 20. Yeah, a 20 fits in there loosely. So I'm going to loosen that screw, and we'll do this again. Yeah, a little bit loose on the 18. and it's actually smaller than 20. So I'm happy with that. You know, both of these are set to about 19. So I'm going to get the flywheel back on, and then we'll check for spark. All right, so we're going to check the top cylinder first with the plug and the tester. All right, we've got nice strong spark on the top cylinder. Let's try the bottom one. And, you know, this wire might give a false reading with this tester since we have 2 cylinders. So I'm going to try to keep that out of the way. But we test the other one here. All right, no spark on the bottom cylinder that I could see. And, well, the tester was blinking red. So we need to sand those points a little bit more to get spark on both cylinders. So I've sanded the points again, and we're about to try it out, but I do want to add a little bit of oil right here. This lubricates basically this cam that actuates the points. And if you let it run dry like it was, you know, it's just going to cause unnecessary wear. All right, let's check for spark again here on the bottom. And there we go. Got strong spark. So both cylinders have spark. They both have compression. All we need is fuel. I also don't have any specs on this flywheel, but it is a nylock nut. And the crankshaft's pretty thin, so I'm going to go easy on it so I don't damage it. That should be good enough. All right, let's see if we can get the carb out. Starting with this part right here. This is actually a fuel filter, which goes down into the bowl. So that, we don't need to disconnect from the fuel pump. We can just kind of leave that and separate it from the carb. And once that is free, there are 2 nuts holding the carb on and some linkage like the choke that we need to disconnect. Actually, we can probably do that now. And the throttle, not actually connected to anything. It's just bumped on this rod right here. So really, we just need to break that free, get those 2 nuts off, and the carb should come right out. Okay, that is free. Might have been a little bit too optimistic here. right, so I'm going to start just by getting off these two screws that hold this cap on. Underneath it should be the float, as well as the needle. Okay. And the needle assembly is a little bit different than what I'm used to seeing. But the needle itself is not moving, so it's likely stuck. We got the float, which is also kind of stuck. Although I can spin it. There we go. And just a bit of oil in the bottom. So this area looks pretty good. We also have a bunch of jets we can remove. Looks like we have one there, maybe something behind there. And we have another jet there and possibly another here, although I think that might be a drain. But let's start with the top one here. All right, that is coming out. It's pretty gummy. Yeah, and it's a good thing we pulled that out. It almost didn't come out. It was pretty gummed up. Let's try this one. Oh, and that one's turning, so that might be a needle. Let's see where it's at. Half, one, about 1 3/4. Just a bit less. Let's try this little one. Though not with that screwdriver, it doesn't fit. No, that one's not coming out, so I'm going to let it soak before trying that one again. Let's try this screw here, which... Nope, that one's stuck as well. So let's get the cap off, see what's under there. Yeah, it looks like the main jet is in there. Let's see if that'll come out. Yep, that's coming out. And I'm going to try the impact as well on the last two screws or jets that are there. Just going to try it on low. A lot of times the impact will get these out. Nope, not this one. The other one, yeah, we'll try that as well. Just going to try the impact on low, which is probably a bad idea. In this case, it worked. And that just looks like a cap. You know, potentially there's a passage in there we can clean. Looks like it just connects over to the bowl. So yeah, that must just be like a clean out. And I'm guessing the same for this one right here. So you can see I did try to take that off with a little bit more force and kind of failed. So yeah, let's soak this before trying that again. Main jet is plugged. And the emulsion tube, it's hard to tell. Yeah, there's supposed to be little holes here on the side, and I'm kind of seeing hints of them. But they are plugged up pretty bad. And as far as the needle goes, things are pretty locked up. You know, this piece right here should move, but it seems to get stuck. And it pushes against the bottom piece, which I believe would push that needle down, but that's also not moving. So let's see if we can get that pin out. Yeah, it moved a little bit. So things are starting to free up a bit. I still can't get the seat out, but the needle, it is moving. It actually looks to be pretty good. So I'm going to give it, I'd say, another 5 or 10 minutes soak before trying to get this back together. Carb cleaned up pretty well. So it has a good chance of running. You know, this screw I could not get out. Had a few more goes at it. And that one I kind of wish I could, because it looks like that provides access to the emulsion tube. But I did blow through everything with carb spray. You know, everything is clear, so I don't suspect we're going to have an issue there. The main jet was probably one of the most plugged jets I've had to clear. I actually had to use the micro drill bits to kind of dig out all that junk, but now it is clear. Needle cleaned up really well. And this tube right here, there are actually no holes along the side. There's just one on the top, and there's another one down toward the bottom, right where the threads start. So that is clear. So the carb, I would say, has a very good chance of running the engine. So let's get it back together, starting with this tube. And this actually goes right down the center through the emulsion tube. Okay, it bottomed out. At least it won't go down anymore. I don't remember the threads being that high up, so I'm going to have to double check the video just to make sure we don't have an issue there. This air screw was just over 1.5, close to 1 3/4. And I'm just going to set it to the initial setting of 1.5. You know, that will run it a little bit richer. All right, it's 1.5. Okay, the float's in. And just take note, when you install this, these are not the same. The thinner side faces the front. And there's also 2 different screws. The shorter one goes in the front, longer one in the back. And the main jet might be a bit of a challenge. Okay, that went in without issue. And the plug, there was actually an O-ring that I think came off and is still in the ultrasonic, so I'm going to fish that out in a second. And we might be missing a part here because we have the plug for the main jet, and then we have this plug right here. So what went there? And that is the gasket we were missing. It was in the bottom of the ultrasonic. I also double checked the video footage and there was nothing there. You know, that hole is actually not threaded, so not sure what the purpose of it is, but I don't think we're missing anything. And last but not least, this plug. Okay, that should do it. Let's try it out. All right, so we're at the point where theoretically the engine should run. But let's just check the gearbox real quick. I know it shifts into forward and reverse, so I don't think we're going to have an issue there. So this screw we just pulled out, that was the level check screw. And if we were full, you know, there'd be oil coming out of there. So let's pull the one down here. This is the drain. Let's see if we have any oil in the gearbox at all. And that's not good. Water, maybe a little bit of rust. Not seeing a whole lot of oil. And that's it. That's all that came out. Maybe a tablespoon of water and the remnants of what used to be oil. So yeah, let's get this filled up with oil before trying to start it. So I'm going to fill this up just with some 80-90 gear lube. It is not marine grade, which is fine. This is probably just going to be used to flush this anyway. You know, I get the right stuff, but for now, it's a lot better than water. Okay. And we are full. All right, so what do you think? Is it going to run? I hope so. So we'll start with the choke in the closed position and the throttle's in the idle position. And every time I pull the engine over, the carb actually floods over. So the fuel pump is definitely working, but the needle and seat not working so well. So we're probably gonna have to go back in there. But I'm giving it a bit of throttle now. Choke is open. Okay, that sounded good. Let's try starting it in gear. Make sure that prop spins. Choke's back on. Nice. Very nice. Well, so far so good. You know, the engine actually sounds really good. The prop seems to engage and work just fine. But the carb definitely has issues. You know, with the fuel valve on, you know, things look okay. But as soon as the engine starts, you know, I just see fuel pouring out of the throat of the carb. So, you know, although it does sound like it's kind of running out of fuel, it might actually be the opposite problem, and it's just flooding the engine out. So let's start it one more time. I'm going to have you guys situated right over here so you can see what I'm seeing. All right, so I just turned the fuel valve on again. And on first glance, I mean, it looks like we're fine. You know, there's nothing leaking, but that'll change once it starts. So let me try to start it, and just keep your eye right down there. Let's give it some choke. Yeah, right there. It just pours right out. So yeah, the carb, it has issues. All right, back here again. Took a few things apart, and I did actually manage to get the cap off on the bottom. I figured, you know, given that we're having run issues and issues with the needle and seat, we might as well dig in and fix everything that we can. So, you know, I already cleaned this up. It didn't look too bad, but these holes, at least some of them, might have been clogged. So that could have been contributing to the run issue. You know, as far as the flooding, I don't see an issue with the needle. You know, it seems to be functioning fine. I just tested it, did a pressure test, seems to be holding back the pressure as well. So I don't think the issue is there. You know, potentially it is, but, you know, one thing that maybe could be to blame is that, you know, I put this back together the way that it came apart, and it was installed like this. But I just watched a video on YouTube from someone who seems to know this carburetor pretty well, and they indicated that this should actually be installed like that. So yeah, potentially that could make the difference. So I'm going to get this back together and we'll try it out again. All right, so we've got the carb reinstalled, and while installing it, I think I found the reason why this engine will not idle. You know, while putting this fuel filter in place, the impulse line just broke right off. You know, and that's what drives the pump, so I'm thinking likely that was cracked and just hanging on by a little bit. And if that's the case, then that is a massive air leak on a two-stroke engine, and like that, the engine will absolutely not idle. So I'm going to plug that off. We'll try starting it again and see if this time we can get it to idle. Okay, air leak is plugged, fuel is on. Carburetor is not flooding over, so likely the needle problem is fixed as well. So let's make sure we're at idle, or maybe just a bit above. Choke is on, fuel is on. Let's try opening the choke. And we'll give it a little bit more throttle. Okay, choke off. All right, that was a big improvement. Still not idling yet, but it's a lot better. Let's try this again. Give it a bit of throttle. And what I'm noticing too is when the choke's open, we don't get any drips from the carb. It's only when the choke is closed. So that might be a feature versus a flaw. There we go. So even with that air leak, it ran surprisingly long, but it did stall out. And you could hear the change in the way the engine was running. So now that that's plugged, let's see if we can restart it and get it to idle again. Give it a little bit of throttle. A little bit more. And the recoil working a lot better the more I use it. That's turned all the way down, so that's as slow as it can go. It's idling pretty well. Let's see if we can bump it in gear. There we go. You know what I'm noticing? We don't have any water. There should be a stream of water coming out right there, so the impeller likely is no good. So we can't run this for too long. But it seems to be running quite well. Let's try reverse. Yep, that works. Forward again. All right, I've seen enough. The engine works good, as long as we don't have a vacuum leak. So, good. Okay, we're out of the woods, I'd say, as far as the engine goes. It runs well as long as we don't have a vacuum leak. So obviously, that line we need to replace, likely all the lines. But I don't want to do that yet. Likely we are going to have to order some more things. The big issue I saw this time is that we had no water coming out of here. So either it's clogged up or more likely that impeller needs to be rebuilt. So to do that, we have to take off the lower unit. And to make that easier, ideally, I would pivot this engine up. Unfortunately, that hinge is locked up solid. So I've been oiling it pretty much every time I walk by, as well as all these components. And these things are freeing up. I still wouldn't say they're easy to use, but at least they can be used. And the pivot also is freeing up pretty well. But this hinge is not moving at all. So I'm thinking let's try to free that up next. That way we can kind of pivot things up and service the lower unit. As far as the tilt goes, I've been still looking for a manual for this to see if there's any trick to it or if it's really stuck. Some actually lock it so you can't tilt when you're in reverse. Right now we are in neutral, and this lever right here should release the tilt mechanism. And I also pulled this pin just to make sure. But even like this, if I try to lift it up, the only thing that happens is that it starts twisting the board and puts quite a bit of pressure right here on this aluminum. So I'm kind of afraid if I lift it too hard, I might snap these off. So before resorting to excessive force, let's just loosen up these nuts on the shaft, see if that makes any difference. Okay, well that broke free easy enough. So that gives me a bit of hope. Let's try the other side. Get some more penetrator in here. And no, it's not freeing up. So what I might do actually is get a C-clamp and try to secure on this side. You know, that way we're kind of spreading the force out, and then I can pull this a little bit harder without worry that I'm gonna break something here on the back side. So I've got a clamp now on both sides, spreading that force out. Okay, it moved a little. There we go. I wouldn't say it's moving well, but it is moving. And those clamps are actually preventing me from pulling it up any higher, at least the clamp over here. So I'm gonna adjust that slightly, like that. Okay. It's still pretty stuck though. So I'm just gonna work this for a bit until it gets a little bit easier. But I think we're out of the woods on this one. All right, I think we're there. You know, it's still holding itself up without the lock, but at this point, it takes very little force. And actually, I think gravity is going to take over in a second and put it the rest of the way down. So I think we're good as far as this goes. So let's get the lower unit off. Take a look at that pump. So theoretically, this is going to be an easy job. There's just one crusty bolt there, another one up there, and this should come off. But given how this machine's been fighting me, I'm not sure it's going to be that easy. It would help if I had the right size socket. Actually, I'm going to put the brakes on it. I think I need to drain the oil first. So I'm going to tilt this back down. We get the oil out and then continue on. Yeah, the oil, it doesn't look good. There is water obviously mixed in. That's why it has that milk chocolate color. And it's not unexpected. I mean, although we drained the water out, there was still water kind of coating everything. So it's going to take a few oil changes to get this to clean up. And potentially it may not clean up at all. If we have a problem with a seal, that's unrelated to the pump, we might have to rebuild some additional things. But I'm thinking, let's not go crazy with this now. We know the pump is bad and has to be fixed. And the plugs that came out of there, actually, neither one had a seal. And they're supposed to, otherwise water will leak in through the plugs, and potentially it could be that simple. That's not good. All right, that was not too bad. So this right here is what we're after. This is the water pump. We have this copper line right here, which is the water pickup, goes into the pump, and then it gets sent up this right here. There's actually a pipe and a seal that's still kind of in the machine. So we are going to have to pull that out, but this side actually looks pretty good, so I don't think we have to do a whole lot there. But the shaft right here, this is for selecting forward and reverse, and that seal does not look to be in very good shape. So we're going to get that one replaced as well while we're here. Okay, so I haven't worked on one of these before, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that maybe the seal isn't supposed to be here. Like, it almost seems like it should be further down. Not really sure. I'll have to look that up on the diagram, but it is fitting pretty sloppy on there. So we'll get that off. And then we have, looks like 2 7/16 lock nuts. I think a socket would be better for that. Looks like the whole stud came with it, which is fine. And same thing actually over here. Okay, and that's what we're after right there. To be honest, I was expecting it to look a lot worse, like broken pieces, and everything seems to be intact. So, my best guess is that, maybe the seal right here wasn't good, or maybe the pipe wasn't inserted properly, and the pump maybe was pumping and just couldn't get the water up. So we're going to have to check the pipe here, make sure that, you know, it's not clogged, as well as the pipe running up. But the pump does not look terrible. Although, okay, I was going to say, it didn't seem to be turning at first, but it is turning. There is a key in there. Okay, so let's get that out. So the pipe looks pretty good for the water intake. You know, I just blew through it. It is clear. And the seals actually don't look bad either. This one is stuck in place, but you can see the seal, it has this little piece sticking out right there. That's what kind of keys it in and holds it in place. And the water pump has the same thing right there. So the seal that was in there should have stayed in when I pulled this whole unit out, and instead it pulled out. So, you know, it may have been dislodged potentially when it was installed on the machine, and that's maybe why the pump wasn't doing anything. So at this point, I think this housing is free to come up. So I'm going to pry on this gently, and we'll slide that off. All right, so the pump is out. I'm going to get this piece out as well. This seal definitely came out. Like, it should have been flush with the metal. So that for sure would have been letting water in. And there was actually water on the bottom side of the pump too. So the seals there also weren't working too well. So I actually need to clean up this shaft. It's rusted up above, so we'll do that in a minute. Actually, let's do that now. And then we'll remove the set screw, and this whole piece should lift out. There is probably a special tool for this, which I don't have. So hopefully this isn't in there too tight. Okay, it turned just a bit. Not sure I can get the wrench back on there though. At least not with any force. It is turning. Okay, that's probably backed off enough. Let's see if this collar has been released. No, it's not moving. So I'm going to take that set screw all the way out. Maybe run a little bit of penetrating oil down there. So yeah, no smoking gun as far as why we weren't getting any water out. And I shouldn't say any water out. I did see like a slow trickle, but definitely not what it should be. Now granted, the impeller, not in great shape, but it's still together. You know, I was kind of thinking it was going to be in parts. You know, regardless, this had to be done. You know, the seals were in pretty poor shape. And of course, we have no water flow. So this is going to be rebuilt. You know, I also was just checking the seals closely on the intake tube, and they actually seem to be in pretty good shape. Like, I don't think that was the problem. So there's only one more seal to pull out. It's actually still on the motor side, and that is the pipe that actually brings the water up to the engine. So let's get that seal off real quick and take a closer look at that. Well, surprisingly, this seal actually isn't that bad either. It's not torn or cracked, still flexible, so I don't think that was the issue. And just as a triple check, I just ran water through that copper pipe, and it had no issues going right up to the engine, and I saw it bleeding out where the water should. So the pipe is not clogged. I think the issue is just some worn out parts and potentially, you know, some bad seals. So I'm going to get some new parts ordered up, and then we can finish this up. All right, so it only took a few days, and we have, I think, all the parts needed to get this water pump fully rebuilt. So I'm going to take a second, just kind of sort through stuff and figure out what's what, and then we'll start the rebuild. So we're going to start with the shift shaft. So we just pulled out the old seal. There's also an O-ring here on the bottom. Let's pull that out. So, yeah, we didn't quite get it all out. The metal cage that goes around the seal, it actually looks like it stayed in place and only the old seal came out. So we need to get that out before we can get the new seal installed. There we go. Right, so next we have the bottom half of the water pump. We just have this O-ring here, so have a new one we can replace it with. And we also have a new seal for the drive shaft. Now this seal, I thought for a second was the wrong one. You know, it does look different, and the inner diameter also appears different, but you know, I test fit this on the drive shaft and it seems to fit just fine. It's actually a nice snug fit. So I think this is the right part. At least that's my hope. So let's get the old stuff out and we'll get the new stuff in its place. Yeah, I'm a little concerned prying on this old plastic, so it might be better to maybe get this cup out if we can and just punch from the other side. But the cup seems to be locked in there as well. But we can probably do it with the cup installed. Okay, it looks like we got it most of the way out. There we go. All right, now we have the top of the pump housing. So we'll get this seal swapped out. And I think the same thing just happened. So the seal came right out, but the metal cage, it is still in there. And this one's going to be a little bit more tricky, I think, to get out. There we go. Only one casualty. So let's start with the shift shaft. I'm just going to get some grease on here so we don't tear up the new seal. And we'll slide it in place and lock it in with the set pin. There's also an O-ring that goes up here. We'll get that installed as well. So we'll get this O-ring in place. It goes right down there on the groove. And this was actually missing when I pulled this apart. All right, so that is good. I'm just going to grease up the connection right here. And we need to try to keep this in the position that it's in. You know, when I took it apart, the shift shaft was in neutral. And that lever needs to be in that position when this goes back together. So that is it for the shift shaft. Let's get the water pump back in. And actually, before we get the pump base on, I'm going to install the new seal for the water intake. Now, one side is tapered and the other side is not. So I believe the tapered side goes up. And you want to make sure that is keyed into that hole to lock it in place. Like that. Then we slide this on, just being mindful not to destroy the new seal. All right, now for the challenging part. There is a flat right down there where a key goes. And the key, you need to kind of stick it in place with some grease and then work the impeller down over that key, which is probably not going to be a one-shot deal. So let me try to stick that key in there and then we'll attempt to get the impeller installed. And as you can tell, it's definitely going to be a challenge. So I feel like it might be a little bit less grief to maybe compress these vanes with a zip tie. That way we're not fighting with the key. Because that key is going to fall out, you know, if we're doing this on the engine. So I'm just going to slowly cinch this tighter and tighter until we get the vanes kind of going in the direction that we need. And I might need to drop that down a little more. Don't know if this is going to work. But we will find out. All right, let's try that. And I also added a green mark to where the keyway is. So like this, at least we have a good starting point. You know, I don't want to cinch it too tight because we're not applying even pressure, but now I think these are going to go in a lot easier. Okay, I think that's it. We're in. We seem to be locked. You know, if I hold the impeller or try to hold it and then spin the shaft, the impeller keeps spinning, so we should be good to get the metal cap back on. Don't want to make these too tight. You know, this is old plastic. And I found out the exact year of this engine, by the way. It is a 1967 model. And according to the parts diagram, that random rubber ring does belong there. So I got a new one of those. And similar to the shift shaft, there's an O-ring that belongs on the top of the drive shaft. I guess we'll get this seal in while we're here. Now there is a nylon washer that goes down in here. I did order a new one. Unfortunately, the one that came was the wrong size. And the thing that's not clear to me is which way this goes. You can see that, one way is different from the other. There is like a shoulder cut in there, but I believe it went with the shoulder facing up. And we've also got a new seal for this connection right here. Now, this one appears to be the same, so I don't think it matters which side is up. But there is a hole on this side that's going to lock it in place. We want to make sure we align that and push it down until this tab pops into that hole. Okay, I think we're in. I was expecting it to pop out, but it is in the slot. All right, now for the fun part. We need to get the lower unit back on. So we need to align the drive shaft, the shift shaft, and get the pipe into the pump. So I just tested the drive shaft and the transmission. Both seem to be engaged properly. I think right now the pipe is kind of hanging us up. So I've got the nuts secured. I'm just going to try to push it to get that gap to close before tightening it the rest of the way. All right, we got the fuel plumbed back in. The plug is still in place for the breather, and we are in neutral. So this time we're going to get the engine started, and hopefully we see a stream of water coming out the side here. So got the choke on. Let's give this a try. So I think we're looking pretty good. This time we had a good stream of water coming out of the engine, so the rebuilt water pump, I would say, is doing a very good job. And the lower unit, I think, is done. And on the engine side of things, we are getting pretty close. You know, the biggest outstanding item is just repairing this fuel line right here. But I also want to replace the missing points cover. Now, that is a discontinued part, but I did find a used one from a slightly larger engine, which I think will fit. So that'll be here tomorrow. So when that shows up, we'll try installing it. We'll do the final repair and get the cover back on. All right, so I'm still waiting on parts to finish up the boat motor, and thought I'd spend the time just cleaning up the seal. This is what goes around the engine cover. And I've been just picking at it, you know, scraping it, and it's not coming very clean. So I decided to try a little bit of acetone, and that actually seems to be working really well. So just a bit of acetone, a little back and forth, and it still is a bit of work, but this actually completely removes the old adhesive. So I think you get the idea. You know, I've done a little bit on this side. It's cleaned up really well, so I'm going to keep going, get all this old adhesive off, and then we'll get some new adhesive and resecure the seal. All right, it's been a few days, and I think we're ready to finish this up, starting with the points cover. Now, this is for a larger engine, actually built a couple years after this, but I think it will fit. So let's pull the flywheel and find out. So, of course, the key fell into a very hard to reach spot. Yeah, I think that'll work. You know, this edge looks to be a little bit messed up. So hopefully that doesn't cause any interference with the flywheel. But let's secure it. We'll get it reinstalled and spin it over and just make sure there's no contact. I think we're good. So we get the choke lever back in place. And then there's a spring that goes on this shaft right here, and it hooks over to the choke plate. Now, I removed it because it kept falling off. And of course, now it works fine. So there was a chance maybe I didn't put that choke lever on correctly. But it looks like we're good now. All right, and last but not least, we have the new line we have to run from the engine breather over to the pump. So I've already removed the old line. And we just need to get a new one in its place. You know what, on second thought, I'm not going to use this. Don't think it's marine rated. And if this thing rusts up, someone's really not going to be happy about it. So, I mean, technically, I don't think we need anything here. You know, this line does not carry fuel. And it's not going to come off for a leak. So we'll just skip the clamp. And finally, the last piece of the puzzle. So I wasn't sure what kind of adhesive to use to re-secure this, but the reviews on this were pretty good. This is just 3M black super weather strip adhesive, and it's usually used for attaching weather stripping to car doors, which I think is probably the equivalent of what we're doing here. So I need to apply a thin layer to both sides, let it tack up, then we can get it installed. It's impressive how quickly this set, I kind of had to rush getting it on, and it's only been on for a few minutes, and it's in there pretty good. Well, now that we're fully back together, there is one more test we need to do. So I did just restart it using gravity to feed the carb. Of course, the fuel pump should now be operational. So I'm going to try to restart it. This time the fuel is going to be way down here. And I want to make sure that that pump is able to pump it up to the motor. Well, I think it's safe to say that the fuel pump is working just fine. I just ran for 5 minutes with the fuel tank well below the level of the engine. So, at this point, I think we are 100%. Had no issues idling, no issues throttling up. So I think the real question is, can I find a boat to test this motor on? That I am not sure, but I'm going to try. I just realized I never tightened these nuts back up, so might want to do that because today's the day. I do have a friend close by whose dad does have a lake house. That lake house is actually on an island in the middle of the lake, so it's going to be a bit of logistics to get everything out there, but that is the plan today, so I will meet you there in a bit. All right, I've got the nuts secured and just working out the final details. The first one being this clamp right here. Although it does work, it is missing the metal plate, and like that, it's just going to stab into the boat and cause damage. So I did cut up a piece of flat bar and added a little dimple to help, well, center it, and the pin should lock into that so the plate does not slide out. And the last thing I've been kind of struggling with is the fuel system, how to adapt this to that. I did order what I thought was the correct fitting for this motor, but when I went to try it out, I realized it was not correct. I think it was a later design. So, what we've been doing for testing is just using this 1/4-inch line, which actually fits on here pretty well. So what I'm going to do is, well, use a longer line, but I've also made up this adapter that takes a 1/4-inch barbed on one side and adapts it to something that will be compatible with this tank. All right, so we made it to the lake, and everything else is here as well. So I'm just waiting to get picked up, brought out to the island, and we'll try it out. Brought the paddles just in case. Adjust the tilt a little bit. That boat is pointing pretty much straight up, so we can adjust it one more setting. So let's kill the engine. Adjusted. Let's see if we restart. There we go. check that water stream. Yep, still there. And it looks like we picked up a little bit of seaweed. All right, let's keep going. Shutting it down. We don't have a stream. So thankfully I noticed it in time, but when going at full throttle, I noticed the power starting to drop. You know, as if it was starving for fuel, or maybe the engine was starting to tighten up. So thankfully I stopped and checked, and we didn't have a stream. So this did happen a few times off camera during testing, that like some debris or something is breaking internally, or breaking free, I should say, from the water jackets, and periodically clogging things up, at least the stream. You know, whether it's actually clogging the whole system up, I'm not sure. But I was able to free it up just by using a piece of extra fuel line and blowing kind of backwards through the system. Now we have good flow. So let's continue on. And I do have paddles and a cell phone, so I can call for help if needed. But I'm willing to bet this old 67 Mercury is going to do it just fine. All right, guys, and that is it. You know, this one was a challenge. I've never worked on a boat motor before. You know, I really did not think this would ever be on a lake again, but it did pretty well. You know, aside from the little water pump scare, you know, thankfully that cleared up. We got a good jet of water coming out of the side, and I ran this for a good 45 minutes to maybe an hour and had no issues at all. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.